mostly doctors, but I'm especially intimidated by mothers and of patients with arthritis, and even more so by grandmothers. So if I sound a little nervous, that's the reason. So I think what I'm going to cover today is, before I get to that, I know there's a question that's going to come up, and no, it's not true. All pediatric rheumatologists aren't bald with beards. At least the women aren't. And I'm going to speak mostly about the Childhood Arthritis and Rheumatology Research Alliance, but I will cover some topics that Dr. Colbert went over briefly in a little bit more detail. First of all, our mission is to prevent, treat, and cure rheumatic diseases in children and adolescents through fostering, facilitating, and conducting high-quality research. Our vision is to perform clinical trials to define optimal care, to conduct research that will translate to prevention, better treatment, and cure, to investigate methods to improve quality of life in children, and to promote a culture where all children will participate in research protocols. And our goal, which is a very aggressive goal, is that CARA will provide every child with a rheumatic disease in the United States and Canada an opportunity to participate in a research study by 2012. Now, much of what Dr. Colbert reported to you today about progress in the treatment of juvenile arthritis is directly due to what's loosely referred to as the Pediatric Rule of the FDA. And that actually is the combination of two acts. One's called Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Equity Act. And there's a carrot and a stick. It's not really pointable, but you can see the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is if a drug company has a drug that has never been tested in children, and they do like an NSAID in osteoarthritis, and they do some very simple studies of dosing and pharmacokinetics in children, they can get a 6-month extension of their exclusivity rights, which is like their patent, which can be millions and sometimes $1 billion. The stick in this act, in this rule, is that for companies coming out with new treatments, especially the biologics in RA, in adult RA, they have to commit to doing efficacy and safety studies in children in the analogous condition, which is, and for adult RA, it's polyarticular JAA. And so this has resulted in a huge amount of research, clinical research, in children with polyarticular coarse JAA, and it's resulted in the FDA approval of adalimumab, etanercept, abatacept, and tocilizumab, which are a great help to our patients. But they're driven by this rule, and in some cases the best interests of the pharmaceutical companies that make these agents. It ignores a huge amount of work that needs to be done also. Like systemic JAA, it's not recognized as having an analog in adult medicine. Neither is oligoarticular JAA or uveitis secondary to JAA. It doesn't encourage looking at combinations of drugs or comparisons of agents. And so there's this big void of investigations that needs to be done, and that's where CARA steps in. So why do we need a research? So that's called industry-sponsored studies. Those studies are industry-sponsored studies. And I don't want to give you the impression I don't like industry-sponsored studies. It's changed my life as well as your kids' lives, so it's a wonderful thing. But we also need multi-center collaboration, as no one site has enough subjects to achieve meaningful significance. We need answers to questions that are not driven by the pediatric rule, as I mentioned. What's the expected long-term outcome for children with JAA? What's the best treatment for JAA? Similarly for uveitis. what's the best treatment for SLE nephritis, for recurrent SLE nephritis? How can we best protect the ovaries of girls who receive cyclophosphamide for lupus? And how do we measure disease activity in linear scleroderma? I don't know how many of the families here are involved with patients with those conditions, but believe me, they make up a big part of what pediatric rheumatologists take care of. And so those are also very significant questions that need to be answered. And how can we do them? As Bob mentioned, there are 3 kinds of studies: randomized clinical trials, observational studies, and translational studies. And I'd like to go in a little bit deeper about these kinds of study designs. The gold standard is what's called a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And having tried to enroll subjects, probably many of your children, in randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials, I can watch you cringe each time I mention the word randomized and placebo-controlled, because parents don't necessarily want their child's treatment determined by a flip of a coin. And although investigators have to have what's called equipoise, that's the balance on the slide, we have to ethically do a study, we have to not know with certainty which arm of the study it's better to be in, whether it's the active drug arm or the placebo arm. Otherwise, we can't sleep at night. We'd be putting kids on a treatment that we knew was inferior, so that wouldn't be good. But parents, for the most part, in my experience, don't have equipoise. They're interested in enrolling in studies because they believe that the experimental agent is going to help their child. And so, and they're not interested so much in getting placebo. And certainly they're not interested so much in having who determines the method to determine who gets placebo and who gets active drug is determined by a computer or a flip of a dice. So I know that those things make you uncomfortable, but this is the highest level of evidence that we have if we get results from a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. There are a lot of biases that are not introduced in this kind of study. So we have to come up to make this more palatable to you with inventive study designs. And we have to, I'm here today to tell you about a lot of the advantages of being in studies like this, including what Bob hinted at, oversight by a number of regulatory agencies. The one I'm putting on this slide that's unique for an interventional trial is what's called the Disease Safety Monitoring Board. Data Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB. And these are attached to all interventional trials. They're meant to be independent boards that have close oversight over the conduct of the trial, over the preliminary results, in order to protect the patients who are enrolled in the study and to ensure that the caliber of the study will be such that the results will inform the way they were supposed to. Randomized clinical trials are very expensive but are the most rigorous. Now, in observational studies, this is another area of study that you can elect to participate in or not. But you should know that there's no intervention. Patients are treated with standard care, what their doctor would have treated you with anyway. And then we're just collecting data in a much more structured and comprehensive way to try to gain some insight as to how drugs are affecting outcomes, how safe drugs are, predisposing factors that might be identified that are associated with a poor outcome or a better outcome. This has the advantage of not having you cringe and not having to say those 2 words. It also has the advantage of being very generalizable to the world, the way the patients are treated in the world, because the clinical trials are very protocolized and there's very little leeway in what the physician can do. But that's not really what happens in the real world. Physicians might lower the dose or raise the dose or give a concurrent med that might have not been able to be used in a randomized controlled trial, or they would give it in a subject who was slightly less affected than the inclusion criteria for that randomized clinical trial. So we get information from these observational studies that we can't get in clinical trials. And then all of these studies can be attached to what are called translational studies, and that's where the patient and sometimes the families give some specimens, usually blood, urine, tissue, and we do analysis of serum, plasma, RNA, DNA, and proteins. We get the clinical information about the patients at the same time, and so we can try to make associations between certain clinical associations and certain laboratory findings. We can see if there are any predictors of response to medication. We can see if there are any predictors of poor outcome. And all of this is important, and it's what's driving the concept of personalized medicine. Maybe your DNA or your RNA expression will identify you as a responder to etanercept rather than abatacept. Instead of treating everybody with etanercept first, and as they fail, then add something else, or switch to something else, perhaps we should be starting people on different medications based on their biology. And that's largely what translational studies are designed to discover. And that's called personalized medicine. So besides the DSMB, which is usually a part of the study, every study that's done that involves human subjects is overseen by an institutional review board, or IRB. It's a committee of lay people, lawyers, statisticians, nurses, ethicists, physicians, charged with overseeing essentially all aspects of the research to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks, that the subject's rights, safety, and well-being are protected, that it's ethically and scientifically sound. There's no point in doing an ethical study if it's not scientifically sound, or vice versa. And there's some evidence that the study design is sound, that the people who are doing the studies are qualified, and that there's the voluntariness of participating is preserved. So all of our studies have to be approved by IRBs. Now, you wonder why people want to enter research studies. This is from adult data, but I've seen similar pediatric data. Most people enter research studies to find a better treatment for themselves, not just for society. And 79% to advance science, 49% to receive higher quality care, and I'll talk about that some more, 30% to receive free medicine or to be paid, 15% because they trust their doctor and the doctor advised them to, and 9% because of information they got from family and friends. So there's a whole number of reasons why people volunteer. But I think the most persuasive evidence why you should consider volunteering is to look at the children's oncology groups. Their mortality rate, which is in the triangles that are sinking down by 2005, that decrease in mortality rate from childhood cancer was directly, it was associated with the formation of a number of clinical research networks, all of which used protocolized care in an iterative fashion. That is, they treat, let's say, leukemia, childhood leukemia, with one drug A and drug B. And they compared that to drug A and drug C. And then they'd see that C did better, A and C did better than A and B. So then the next one they would do A and C and D versus A, C, and E. And they'd keep doing these studies over and over again until they really drilled home on the right combination of medications to use for a certain kind of lymphoma, to the point now where 90% of all childhood cancers are cured. And it's been shown that patients taking the same cocktail of medications outside the protocolized care, outside the study, don't do as well as patients who are in the study and get the same treatments. There's something about the protocolized nature of the care, the fact that doctors' hands are tied somewhat, and they have to treat a certain way because everybody's treating that way. And there are committees overseeing that. The sponsors overseeing it, the DSMB is overseeing it, the IRB is overseeing it, the investigator is overseeing it, and that kind of meticulous care results in better outcomes. Okay, so now I'm going to just move to CARA. We are a network of 304 pediatric rheumatologists, 71 trainees in North America, United States, and Canada. Essentially all the pediatric rheumatologists in North America are part of our network. We're a democratic organization with an elected steering committee, an external advisory committee. We have a number of committees that take on various roles in making our network work. And we're at 92 sites, mostly children's hospitals throughout North America. This is where we have a presence. It's nice to see that so many red dots in Canada and in the United States, but you can see there are large parts of the country where there are no centers close by, and they correspond to parts of the country where there are no pediatric rheumatologists nearby, and that is a major problem in our country. The estimate is that about 50% of all children with chronic rheumatic diseases are not taken care of by a pediatric rheumatologist because of access problems. So we have had major clinical trials. APPLE, every clinical trial has to have a clever acronym. So APPLE, the Atherosclerosis Prevention in Pediatric Lupus Erythematosus trial, has been completed. The seminal manuscript has been accepted for publication. TREAT, a trial of early aggressive therapy in polyarticular JAA, has just been, the manuscript has just been written and is being sent for consideration of publication. Rituximab and myositis, or the RIM trial, the data is locked and the results have been presented. Similarly, for uveitis treatment with infliximab, it's close to enrollment. My study, the last study, RAPPORT, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, randomized placebo-phase study of rilonacept in the treatment of systemic JIA. I have to say Bob helped me with that, so we call it now the Colbert Rapport. That was his joke, though. I didn't make that up. All right, now so besides clinical trials, we're also involved in observational studies. CARA-NET is a large initiative funded by ARA funding related to President Obama's stimulus package. Which is going to be an informatics infrastructure from which, on which these other two studies, CARA-RX and JIA SLE Consolidated Registry, will lean on, and I'll go through that in some detail. So CARA-NET had a number of specific aims. It was funded by NIAMS. It's going to involve 10,000 subjects in 2 years. So far, we have 4,000 subjects enrolled in our registry, 3/4 of whom have JIA, 10% have pediatric SLE, and about 7-8% have juvenile dermatomyositis. We're also developing an informatics infrastructure, which I won't spend too much time except to say it's the state of the art. I don't understand it, but there are people who do, and luckily some of them work with us. And it also, one of our third specific aim is to supply support to the sites. Some of our sites in these children's hospitals and other hospitals around the country are working very hard to get these studies done, to recruit subjects and to follow study procedures, and they're really not being paid for their time adequately, so we need to make them more efficient in order to keep this initiative going. And we're doing that under this CARA-NET grant. And we're developing a CARA Translational Research Laboratory, which will serve as a resource for these studies that are ongoing and also for future studies. And lastly, through the Arthritis Foundation, largely, we are trying to engage families and volunteer health organizations to develop scientific priorities, understand the barriers to to participation in clinical research and try to facilitate local awareness about some of the things that we're doing, like I'm telling you today. This is the informatics infrastructure, and you'll just get a headache, so I'll keep going. And anybody who's sophisticated in computers, I invite you up later to teach me. So CARA-RX is an initiative to develop consensus best treatments for most of our diseases. We have some data on which to base treatment, but really not enough data to be confident that we have the best treatments. And for that reason, there's a lot of variation in the community. If you ask 10 pediatric rheumatologists how they treat pediatric lupus nephritis, you're going to get 8 different results. They'll be similar in some ways, but they won't be exactly the same. So this is an initiative where we got all of us into a room, went over the existing evidence, started talking about how we treat our own patients and what we look for and what our procedures are, and we tried to come to some consensus and develop 3 or 4 arms of a treatment protocol, of a treatment plan that would be used as standard care. And then in observational studies, we would see which patients were safer, which patients got better, had better outcomes, et cetera, and then use those data in an iterative fashion again to recraft our few treatment plans. And that work is ongoing, and I think that there'll be opportunities to participate in those trials. They're not really trials, they're observational studies, because the patient's getting treated just the way their pediatrician would, pediatric rheumatologist would. He's just choosing from a menu of 3 or 4 different treatments that he uses anyway, but that are somewhat standard. So instead of tapering down by 5% of his prednisone on day 2, he'll taper down by 7%, so he'll be in, because that's the way the guideline came out. And the last big initiative is what's called JAA Core. And I'm sure many of you have heard about this FDA communication that was published in August of 2009 about 48 children who developed malignancy over an 8-year period, 32 in the United States and 16 patients outside of the US from 2001 to 2008. 31 of those cases were patients were being treated with infliximab, mostly for inflammatory bowel disease, only 5 for a rheumatic disease. 15 were treated with etanercept, 14 of which were for rheumatic disease. 2 were treated with adalimumab, 1 with rheumatic disease. And the reason the numbers are so low with adalimumab is it wasn't available early on in this study period. They compared the cases of cancer in the United States to the denominator of the number of patients exposed to the drug. And they thought there was some evidence of an increased signal, so an increased risk of cancer. It's hard to interpret these data. 10 of the pediatric cases were hepatosplenic T-cell lymphoma, which were only reported in IBD patients, and these IBD patients were on 6-mercaptopurine or azathioprine, also known to be associated with an increased risk of cancer. 7 patients had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, 6 had Hodgkin's lymphoma, 6 had leukemia, 3 melanoma, 3 thyroid cancer, 1 each of 13 other cancers. 21 occurred in Crohn's disease, 11 with 6-MP as a concurrent med, 15 were in JIA, 4 with ulcerative colitis, and 2 with 6-MP, and 2 in utero. There were 3 who had ankylosing spondylitis. So when you look at this data, you get worried about it, but it's really hard to know whether the increase in signal is related to the concurrent meds, like 6-MP and Imuran, the disease, like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which clearly had higher rates of especially certain types of malignancies, or that there is an increased incidence of cancer among children with JAA that's uncontrolled. That has been shown in adults. So when they compare the frequency of cancer in exposed people to these drugs and compare them to the frequency of cancer to normal children without JAA, that may not be the right question to ask. So JAA Core, my time is almost up, so I'll just quickly finish that. JAA Core is meant to try to answer these kinds of questions about rare events that a proprietary registry that each of these companies has to maintain after their drug is marketed can't do. So they're powered to detect serious, so there are registries that each company commits to do when they get the drug approved. They're powered to detect, they have enough patients to detect serious infections, laboratory abnormalities that are relatively frequent. They'll be able to identify those kinds of signals. But rare events like cancer or multiple sclerosis, they're not able to detect. So the proprietary registry is designed to do one registry, not have one for Enbrel, not have one for adalimumab, have one for abatacept, but have one for all JAA patients, whether they're being exposed to biologics or not, and looking at the rates of these events, which would be much more informative and a robust source of data. We do a lot of other things. I've just told you some of our big ones. We have studies in almost all the diseases we take care of. And as Bob hinted at, and as I think I will reiterate, we're very, very lucky to be pediatric rheumatologists at this time. And in some ways, I know you feel unlucky, but this is a very good time to be able to participate in this process of learning more about these diseases. The knowledge that's being generated is exponentially increasing every year, and I think we will have cures for these patients, and that's going to come via better understanding of the mechanisms of disease. So with that, I'm really glad to have been given this opportunity to speak to you, and I think there'll be time for some questions. Is that right? Thank you.
I don't know, it fills me with hope. So we want to be careful with our time, so I'm going to ask that we keep questions to about 10 minutes, and I'll be really rude and sort